Delighted to have you with us today for today's conference on the Chinese economic slowdown, why it matters, and what the strategic implications are. This is a critical issue for the global economy. It is a critical issue for the economies of Asia, but it's also an issue that's critical to strategic developments. And we at Hudson have always stressed the important links between economics and grand strategy, and economics and international affairs, going back to Herman Kahn's, our founder's, pioneering work on the future of Japan. Herman Kahn, of course, was the first to recognize that Japan would be the world's second largest economy. He did so in the context of a study that he was doing for the Pentagon in 1962 that looked at growth rates in Japan as part of an examination of Japan's potential to develop and significantly expand its defense capabilities. And so these issues we at Hudson recognize that these issues are interlinked, that technology, innovation, rates of economic growth affect the relative positions of nations around the world. And we're very fortunate to have with us today John Lee, who is a senior fellow with Hudson Institute, based in Sydney, Australia. And John is well known in his own country as a leading analyst of both international affairs and of defense policy, and his work on the Chinese economy and the challenges that it faces have appeared in such publications as the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he's been semi-regular actually on CNBC discussing these issues as well. So John's doctorate is in international relations, and he also teaches at the Australian National University, and we're very fortunate that he's able to bring with us a global perspective on this issue, which looks somewhat different, I think, in Asia than it does here in the United States. So without any further ado, delighted to welcome John Lee and look forward to hearing from him. Thank you very much.
Ken, thank you very much for that kind introduction. As Ken mentioned, I'm based in Sydney. This gives Hudson a presence in the very south of the Southern Hemisphere, so I can say that the Hudson Empire, the sun never sets on the Hudson Empire. Thank you all for coming. It's a pretty dreary day out there, so I appreciate you making your time. Just by way of background, this presentation is based on an ongoing 18-month project that I've been doing on the slowing Chinese economy and what that means for American interest. Just to acknowledge my gratitude to the Smith Richardson Foundation, which has been primarily funding this project. So let me get straight down to the part about the slowing Chinese economy. Now, everyone agrees that the days of double-digit growth are in the past. I think recently the growth target has been set at 6.5%. Until recently it was 7%. Now, no one really thinks it's 6.5%. If you talk to investment banks, businesses on the ground, they say it's anywhere between 2, 3, 4, 5%. Look, it doesn't really matter what the actual figure is, we'll never know, but the point is that the Chinese economy is significantly slower in growth than it was a few years ago. Now, immediately I know a lot of you will be thinking, okay, it's not 10%, it's not 11%, but so what? You know, China is, depending on how you measure it, a $10 trillion US economy. Even if China's growing at 4%, I mean, that's still an enormous economic expansion each year. So, so what if it's 4% or 5%? I suppose I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes trying to answer the so what question, why it matters that China is slowing from what it was a few years ago. Now, I don't intend to get too deeply into why China is slowing and why the slowdown, I think, is structural and not just a cyclical, temporary slowdown. But just very briefly, the major problem is just too much debt and too much inefficient investment in the Chinese economy. And this is actually what happened in Japan from the late 80s, 1990s onwards. Now, if you take as a sample the period from 2006 to 2014 in China, the economy in that period, 8-year period, expanded about 162%. Now, of that 162%, 6% was because of what economists call total factor productivity. Was because of labour inputs, just the additional labour inputs into the economy. About 20% of that 162% was total factor productivity, which is essentially using labour or capital more efficiently. And 136% of the 162% was purely because of inserting capital inputs into the economy, basically building things in China, whether those things were needed or not. So the huge amount of capital inputs needed to fuel such a growth model means that national corporate debt levels have gone up from about 147% of GDP in 2008 to over 250% currently. If you include official government debt and unofficial government debt and also corporate debt, you're talking about a figure of around 300% of GDP. Now, even if we put aside the fiscal debt and you focus on national corporate debt, fiscal debt, by the way, is about 50% of GDP currently. If you focus on national corporate debt, the majority of the corporate debt is undertaken by state-owned enterprises, which are implicitly guaranteed by the government. Now, the expansion of corporate debt in China has gone up, and I'll use US dollar figures throughout, has gone up from about $9 trillion to $25 trillion in the last 8 years alone. And if you want to put that in context, in the last 8 years in China, the amount of debt increase equates to about 1.5 times the size of the entire American commercial banking system, which is a much deeper, much larger debt system and economy. So in 8 years, China has created 150% of the American commercial banking system. Now, as occurs with any economy, when you invest more than the economy actually needs, more than there is actually demand for, overcapacity obviously becomes a problem. So you need to put in more and more capital to get the same amount of growth. So 10 years ago, every $2.50 of capital you put in generated $1 of growth. It now takes $6 or $7 of additional capital input to generate $1 of growth, which incidentally is twice as inefficient as, say, a country like India, if you want a comparison. Now, it also means that more and more new capital is being used to manage existing debt. So this means that this worsening debt problem is all but guaranteed, since you can't just grow your way out of trouble, which is what China has done in the last 20 or 30 years. You can't just throw in more and more capital at the problem and expect the same results. You'll get sort of declining, suboptimal results. So China, in this sense, is experiencing something like what Japan experienced in the 1990s. And even if China will grow a little bit faster than the 0.1% that Japan grew, it essentially has the same problem that Japan had a couple of decades ago. Now, let me return to the question why this matters. You know, it might be very interesting economics, the numbers might seem fantastic or troubling, but why does this actually matter from the point of view of China's capacity to project power? Now, as an aside, I think if you travel around a region, there's already a sort of psychological consequence to this with respect to the Chinese slowdown. Like if you traveled around Asia a few years ago and probably even in America, there was this general mantra that, yes, America's the number one power, but time is basically on China's side. That all China really has to do is sit tight, let the 1.3 billion people do its work, and as long as it doesn't do anything stupid, as long as it doesn't promote or provoke a war with the Americans, time will be on China's side, and China will invariably sort of rise to regional and global dominance and prominence. Now, when you have such a psychological state of mind, which was the case a few years ago, you tend to get paralysis in policy. You don't tend to get a lot of creativity in policy because you kind of think that you can't fight the future. But when you realize that the Chinese economy is not invulnerable, it's not invincible, you start getting more creative in terms of how you deal with China's rise. And it hasn't happened in a comprehensive way, but it is happening, and there are more creative discussions going on out there about how you actually manage Chinese power. But that's something vague and ambiguous, as important as I think that psychological state is. So let me get to some specifics about why even a moderate Chinese slowdown actually matters. Now, some of you would say, okay, China's slowing, but if you want to use the metaphor, if you're standing there and a truck is coming towards you, okay, it might be going at 40 miles an hour, not 80 miles an hour, but it's still going to, squash you. So does it really matter? Well, even if China grows at its current pace, let's say it makes 6.5%, which is optimistic. So even if it grows at its current pace or its current official pace, the structural slowdown is going to disproportionately affect central budgets for a number of reasons. And remember, it's the central budget that funds the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and other instruments of Chinese national power. So let me explain why there's going to be a serious consequence for the Chinese central budget and therefore for Chinese power. Now, first of all, let me talk about the revenue side of the fiscal equation. Now, China has a very narrow tax base. It's not like America or other advanced countries. Less than 2% of people in China pay income tax. That's important because income tax is a very stable way of revenue for the government. But less than 2% of people pay income tax. About 5% of the budget is from income taxes. Most of the taxes come from a VAT, which is added to every stage of production, and it also comes from corporate taxes. So the point I'm making here is that fiscal revenue in China is disproportionately linked to business cycles, unlike in most advanced economies. And when the business cycle slows, even moderately, it has a huge hit on the revenue side of the equation, and the evidence is already emerging. Now, if you take the period from 1993 to 2012, government revenue growth averaged around 19-20%, so, growth each year, so in that 20-year period. So that's pretty, those are pretty easy days for the Chinese government. Now, fiscal expenditure growth around the same time averaged the same, about 19-20%. So you basically had growing budgets, but it was balanced because the revenues were pretty good. Now, you consider the slowdown, which really began around 2013. Now, the slowdown was fairly moderate. There was a few GDP percentage points, but revenue growth went from an average of 19-20% over the last 20 years to 8% in 2014. So a sudden drop from 19.8% the year before to 8% in 2014. In the first 6 months of this year, fiscal revenue growth was 6.6%. Expenditure growth, though, was 24.8%. This was the government trying to desperately stimulate the economy as growth was moderating in China. So if you talk to independent banking firms, who I tend to believe more than official figures, and the record is that they're much more accurate than official figures, so I'm talking about the Deutsche Banks, the Goldman Sachses, they're forecasting a 4.5% growth in revenues for the central government and about a 5% decline in revenue for the local governments being all the levels of government beneath the central government. Now, even if it's not going to be as bad as that, it's unavoidable that China is now facing a dramatically shrinking revenue growth, if not an absolute decline in revenue growth. And I'm going to get back to why this matters in a few minutes. Now, let me just get to the expenditure side of it, which is actually a more serious problem for the government. China undertook some fairly radical fiscal reforms in 1994. Prior to 1994, the central government was receiving about 50% of the revenues and was spending about 50% of was behind half of all government spending. Now, after the reforms in 1994, there was a mass centralisation. And so what happened was the central government started to receive 55, 60% of total government revenues, but they only were behind about 20% of fiscal outlay. So local government were getting, 40% of government revenues, but they were behind almost 80, 85% of total government outlay. So there was this huge imbalance. The idea in 1994 was that the central government would take the revenue and give some back to the local governments in the provinces of their choice. Now, like most governments, didn't actually happen. The central governments took the revenue, spent it, and didn't actually give the local government more revenue despite its promises. Now, currently, the shortfall for local governments each year is about $800 billion. And the shortfall is largely made up from proceeds from land sales and real estate. So just imagine this. Levels of government below the central government, you've got a shortfall of $800 billion, which is about 40% of your budget, and you make it up through seizing land or appropriating land, going into business with developers, building residential industrial blocks and selling it in a booming property market. That's actually how local government makes 40% of their budget, or comprise 40% of their budget. So in fact, the huge fixed investment boom after 2008, which occurred in China, about 40% of the fixed investment went into real estate, with the local governments at the heart of the real estate development and boom that occurred after 2008. So the bottom line is that the huge residential property speculative market in China has led to massive overcapacity. Despite what you've been told, the building of residential units, for example, in China has had almost nothing to do with the needs of urbanization. If you look at just the three largest provinces in China alone, there are enough empty, completed, sold residential blocks to house the urbanization needs of the whole country for the next 20 years. So this kind of shows you, this chart sort of shows you that this massive increase in building really had nothing to do with demand or need of the Chinese citizens. It was all about revenue raising for the local governments. So even if there is no residential property price collapse, I mean, some people are talking about a property bubble in China. Even if there is no collapse or bursting of the bubble as such, the market just cannot continue in the same way. I think there's universal agreement on that, given the oversupply and the slowing credit environment in the Chinese economy. So the estimate now is that the proceeds from land and property sales for local governments is likely to halve from the peaks of 2013 as the property boom deflates. Doesn't have to collapse as it just sort of declines and deflates. Now, this equates to a local government fiscal shortfall of about $500 billion each year over the next few years. Now, local governments also can't just borrow their way out of trouble, which is what they've done in the last few years. If you look at the finances now of local governments, every one in three of new borrowings is used just to manage existing debt, because the debt levels is so high now, it's about $5 trillion US, 50% of GDP, that $1 in $3 that they borrow is used just to manage existing debt and stop them from defaulting on existing debt. I had a conversation with a CEO of one of the major Chinese banks a while ago, and I said to him, how do you spend your day? What do you do? What kind of deals do you talk about? And he said, I spend half of my time now renegotiating loans with local governments. So that's the situation now in China. Now, if local governments become, or local government SOEs, which have been behind the property speculation, if they become insolvent, there'll obviously be a serious contagion effect on the whole banking system, because the state-owned banks have been the ultimate backers behind the state-owned entities from the local government side. So this is why Beijing has periodically ordered state-owned banks to just roll over maturing loans to stop them from defaulting. Now, in a perverse kind of way, there's a short-term tactical resilience to the Chinese system. Unlike the situation in America, the government can't just force banks consistently to roll over maturing loans. In China, that's what they constantly do. So on the books, the non-performing loan ratio is extremely low. It's about 3%. But the reality is that it's a lot higher than that. Now, if the central government decides to find a more final solution to this problem, this means that it would have to recognise more than $500 billion worth of distressed and non-performing loans. This would mean hundreds of billions of dollars each year of capital injections into the state-owned banks and the informal financial sector to stabilise it. So obviously that's a very costly exercise, which I don't think the central government could afford to do given its own increasing debt levels. And then you consider the way China's evolving. I mean, the expanding needs for social goods, for example, as the country ages. And I think you all know that China is aging faster than any major country in history, largely because of the one-child policy. Now, if you want to take one comparison, for China to reach comparable levels of GDP per capita spending on social goods compared to not high-income but low-income countries, it would have to find an additional $1 trillion a year to pour into social spending. So if you want to compare China to the average of social spending in other low-income countries in Asia, it would have to find $1 trillion US a year just to kind of meet that low-income standard. I'm not saying that standard is the standard, but just as a comparison of how little China actually spends on social goods, and that part of the budget is just going to increase. Now, let me just get quickly to the implications of this. And once again, to the so what question. Once again, this might all be very interesting, but so what? I mean, okay, it's a problem for the government, but so what when it comes to Chinese power? Now, for a government, and that is local and central, for a government receiving $2.26 trillion US in revenue each year, which is what they received last year, the amounts or the deferred liabilities that I'm talking about are non-trivial. They're highly significant. So I'm going to focus on the central government because it's ultimately the central government that has the capacity to increase China's national power. The central government receives around $1 trillion in revenues each year. After transfers to local government, this is about $250 to $300 billion, the central government spends 40 to 60% of the remaining budget on national security. And when I say national security, I mean the People's Liberation Army and the People's Armed Police. The People's Armed Police is a military-trained domestic force of over 1 million people whose main preoccupation is to control domestic unrest and provide security within China, so in areas like Tibet and Xinjiang, for example. This is distinct from the police force, which is a local government concern, but the PAP, People's Armed Police, is effectively the second military of the Chinese Communist Party. So the central government spends 40 to 60%, depending on whose figures you use, of its budget after transfers to local government on national security. So it's easy to see that if revenue growth declines, which it will, the central government will have to transfer an increasing amount of money to local governments to manage that debt situation. And after all, it's the local governments that build local infrastructure that provide 98% of what social goods are provided by the Chinese government. It is not an option to just ignore the fiscal problems of the local government by the central government. So for the past 2 decades, we've basically had to deal with a China that had no fiscal prohibitions, no fiscal constraints. They didn't really have to make any hard fiscal decisions. They could maximize the amount they spent on projecting national power, and a rising tide tends to lift all boats. We now deal with a China that is living in a real fiscal world like any other normal country, if you like, except there are, I think, unique and serious liabilities and deficiencies in the Chinese society that need to be looked after, that need to be funded, which will be the responsibility of the central government. So let me just offer a couple of broad suggestions as to what this might actually mean if you sort of want to look five years ahead and a little bit beyond. Now, first of all, you're going to get increased funding competition and even cannibalization between the PLA and the PAP, the People's Liberation Army and the People's Armed Police. They dip their hands in the same central budget. It's all under the national security budget. Now, if you get increased competition between the two, the PLA and the PAP, my view is that PAP will get its way because the PAP is there to control domestic unrest. Remember, the number one priority for the Chinese Communist Party is to stay in power, right? It is not to control the South China Sea or East China Sea. It is to stay in power. And it needs a well-funded, well-equipped PAP to deal with domestic unrest. And as many of you would know, domestic unrest is rising quite dramatically, even as China becomes a richer country. Incidentally, the government stopped releasing official figures on domestic unrest about 2 years ago. But 2 years ago, the figure was 184,000 instances of mass unrest. That was 2013 or 2012, can't remember. Mass unrest is 50 or more people protesting against government officials. So the Communist Party has no option but to give the PAP whatever the PAP thinks that it needs. The second consequence is you're going to get increased competition and cannibalization within the PLA. So China has traditionally been a continental power, traditionally been a military based on the army, based on the land. It's trying to become a naval power. Prior to this period, when you have budgets growing at double-digit rates, everyone gets what they want. The PLA Navy gets what it wants, the PLA Army gets what it wants, the Air Force gets what it wants. Like every other normal country, you're going to start to see increased competition between the armed services, and this has strategic implications. I mean, China, if you look at the Chinese Defense White Paper in 2015, it was the first white paper which stated that the sea is as important as the land. It used to be a land focus. The first time it said the sea is as important as the land. Now, that's all fine, but is the PLA Navy, which is relatively new and relatively recent in its capabilities, will it get the increased funding that it needs to become a truly world-class Navy? I think over time, fiscally, that becomes more of a contested question than it has been in the past. This slide here, I don't expect you to read it, the writing's really small, but it's really just talking about the capability gaps that are still significant in the PLA. The point I'm really making is that, particularly with the naval side, which is what we care about, what America cares about and what Australia, my country Australia, cares about, to get its Navy up to shape to be at least a match for the American Navy and the Japanese Navy, it's got enormous capability gaps. It's expensive. It's a lot more expensive than maintaining the capabilities of its land forces. And, so as I mentioned, there is an open question as to whether China is going to be fiscally able to give the PLA Navy all that it's asking for. Now, the third consequence, and this is an economic and a military component. Now, consider China's so-called indigenous innovation strategy in so-called strategic and important sectors, which applies to both industry and military capabilities. This is essentially the desire for China, by the Chinese government, to develop in-house indigenous capabilities in something like 402 sectors and subsectors that it considers critical to national power. Now, if you look at how China has got ahead industrially in the last 10 years or so. Many people think China has an advantage because it had low labor cost, and that's actually why China has managed to get a lot of market share in lots of industries and sectors. That's actually not really true. China's main source of competition has been free or cheap capital given to local firms, also in the forms of subsidies and tax breaks as well. So what China has essentially done is outcompete foreign firms by giving its local companies, particularly state-owned enterprises, free or cheap capital, billions of dollars of subsidies in all sectors that it wants to emphasize, and also tax breaks and regulatory protections as opposed to what is faced by foreign firms. So, for example, to give you an illustration of the scale of the assistance given to local Chinese firms, if you take away the subsidies, the tax breaks, and other direct advantages given to SOEs in the past 10 years, and as you know, China's SOEs dominate every capital-intensive industry in the country. If you remove the subsidies and other advantages, other direct advantages given to these SOEs would all have made a collective loss. If you looked at the books of the SOEs, they would make a collective loss. When the SOEs issue their profit and loss statements every year, they include the subsidies in it. So, it doesn't actually give you a true reflection on how well these SOEs or how badly these SOEs are going or have been going. So, bearing the cost of this so-called state-led indigenous innovation strategy is easy when your revenues are going up at 20%. It's obviously much harder when your revenues are going up at 5% or 0%. So you take the most recent 5-year plan that China released, which goes from 2016 to 2020. Now, in this 5-year plan, China says it will devote $1.5 trillion US in that 5-year period to so-called 7 strategic emerging industries. Now, that's $300 billion a year that the central government has to find to fund just 7 sectors that it considers of enormous importance to Chinese power. I mean, it's very unlikely the Chinese central government's going to find $300 billion that it doesn't already have. Now, I'm just going to let me conclude, and I'll take some questions or comments if you have any. None of this is to suggest that China's going to collapse or that China is a paper tiger or that we don't really have to worry, that we just should sit tight and, time's on our side and we need to do nothing about it. So I'm not suggesting that at all. China is already large enough to be a significant and concerning presence in East Asia. Not yet in the world, but certainly in East Asia. What I am really saying is that time is not necessarily on China's side, as is, I think, still a common wisdom. So you look at China's circumstances, you look at its strategic situation. It is an extremely lonely power strategically. In fact, I've made the point elsewhere, you could make the case that it is the loneliest rising power in world history. China does not have any genuine strategic allies. It's got a few tactical partners, Russia, Pakistan, etc., but it doesn't have any genuine strategic allies that it can leverage off. The economic and social frailties in China are worsening. They're not getting better. The country is aging faster than any other before it. Incidentally, if you want to look at the great powers leading up to 2050, America, largely because of immigration, and India, if you want to count India as a potential great power, they're the only 2 great powers with favourable demographics leading up to 2050. So China has these problems. As you move up the value and innovation ladder, which China is doing, and China's trying to do more rapidly, merely just subsidizing innovation becomes less and less inefficient. You've got to come up with some genuine indigenous sources of innovation. You can't just throw capital at it. You can, achieve something by stealing it from abroad, which, to be frank, the Chinese do, but that in itself isn't going to get you to where you need to be. And you can see politically from the current President Xi's anti-corruption campaign, it's a pretty divided and somewhat vulnerable party. Now, I'm not predicting a collapse of the party. What I am saying is that it is not all chummy and cozy within the Chinese Communist Party. There are enormous problems within the party, and the anti-corruption campaign is as much about factional infighting as it is about removing corrupt officials. So my summary is, it's essentially time that China is going to live in a real fiscal world. It hasn't really had to for the last 10, 15 years. It's now going to have to live in a real fiscal world. It's going to make the real hard decisions that every other major country has to make. It can't just throw money at every ambition that it has. Now, this clearly opens up opportunities when it comes to capacities to compete with China, to shape the kind of competition with China and where and in what you actually compete. So, my conclusion would be that there are enormous opportunities in constructive ways available to America and certainly to allies like Australia, like my country. So I thank you, and I'm more than happy to take any comments or questions. Yep. At the back there.
Hi, thank you. Floriano, science visiting researcher. I was kind of struck with your statement that Chinese growth was more relying on cheap financing and SOEs than on cheap labor.
Yep.
So if we think about like end of 70s, early 80s, when there was not so much money around in China, where did that money come from to provide for this cheap financing of the economy?
China has not just a closed capital account, even though there are leakages where it's difficult to take money out of the country. It's also got a closed banking system which is almost dominated by the state-owned banks. So, in other words, it has almost perfect savings capture. So in the 79 onwards and in 1980s when reforms first began and the economy started to take off, the savings of households were all placed into state-owned banks because there are no alternatives. You couldn't put your money anywhere else. And in the 80s and 90s and this decade, it's largely been state-owned banks that have provided the capital for SOEs to thrive. So, when you have a system where you've got perfect savings capture and depositors have to put money into state-owned institutions, and incidentally, depositors get back a rate of return that's negative in real terms, depositors are effectively subsidizing the industrial activities of mainly SOEs. That's kind of how the Chinese system has worked over the last 10 or 15 years. And one consequence is that's why you've got fairly suppressed household income levels and very high SOE revenue levels, because much of the country's wealth has been given to SOEs. But to answer your question, that's where they get it from, the banking system. I mean, China is not like America or other advanced economies where sources of finance are quite diverse. In China, you either get money from state-owned banks. Increasingly, you get it from the so-called shadow banking sector, which ultimately state-owned banks are kind of behind anyway. But ultimately, it's from the banking sector. There's not a huge bond market in China. Even the stock markets aren't really a major source of capital raising. It's really from banks, and there's perfect savings capture. Yep. Yeah.
Brian Marshall, I'm semi-retired. And you indicated that China has a relatively narrow tax base, only 2% of the population paying into it, and most of the government revenues come from the VAT. What's to prevent the government from changing that situation, expanding the tax base?
I mean, first of all, China has a huge informal economy, like lots of developing Asian economies. So, if you run and lots of these businesses are not registered. So there's no institutional capacity to collect across the board household or income tax revenue. The second thing is that because China is such a fixed investment-driven economy, even if you wanted to target households, the wealth isn't with households, it's with the corporations. So, you might broaden your tax base, but you won't get as much from households as you would anyway. But the main problem is the institutional one. It's just, they just don't have the institutional capacity to collect income tax because it's such an informal economy. This is actually not unusual in much of Asia. So, for example, Malaysia, which is the country I was born, Malaysia's middle income country, but only about 8% of people pay income tax because there's such a huge informal economy, which is why VAT is really the only way you can kind of tax people. And VAT is on every stage of production, it's not just on final consumption in China. Yeah.
Apropos your last comment, isn't this a transition that all the Asian countries have had to make, that Taiwan, Korea, and Japan have started off at one point was very informal economies. As they modernized, they had to figure out how to do this. So this is nothing unusual.
No, it's nothing unusual, but none of these economies wanted to rival America as a great power. So
Japan did.
well, not in the military terms. So my point is that if
1940?
Post 1940,
But
yeah.
in the Meiji Revolution from 1880 up to 1940,
Well,
figure out how to build a modern country.
look, my point is not that this is unique to China. My point is that for a country that spends 40 to 60% of its discretionary central budget on national defense or national security, it can't keep on doing that. And the fact that you can't keep on, so, no, but I understand your point, yeah. Abe.
Abe Shulsky here at Hudson. What would be the possibilities of trying to give the local governments their own sources of revenue? I mean, that's a lot of what you're saying seems to depend on the fact that the local governments really don't have any source of revenue other than land sales, and that's got to come to an end. But things like real estate taxes and all the other kinds of things that we're familiar with, would that be a possible way out for them?
It's a partial possible way out, but the whole reason why centralisation in 1994 occurred was because local governments, when they're not restrained, tend to overtax people, and it creates a lot of resentment. It also does a lot of damage at an economic level to this idea of trying to raise household income to rebalance the economy into a much more consumption-driven economy. So, yeah, it would help a little bit, but the problem is that local governments are now so deeply indebted that for the taxation powers to make any difference to their debt levels, it would have to be enormously oppressive taxes, which would obviously feed into the whole stability issue for central government. And central government, local governments as well, there's also a competency and corruption issue. So the central government's fairly reluctant to allow the local government to do that. Little things central government has done in the last year or so, it's allowed local governments to issue bonds to pay for specific infrastructure projects, but not for actual revenue-raising purposes or general revenue-raising purposes. But once again, the only reason why people buy these bonds is because it's guaranteed by the central government.
I teach over at Georgetown. The most impressive number to me that you presented was China would have to spend an additional $1 trillion in social programs to come up to the level of what its neighbors are doing.
Well, its low-income neighbors are doing, not
Even low-income countries. It's a big failure, what's happening now, and one of the results is that people are forced, in effect, to save enormous amounts of money at household level to protect themselves from extremes of poverty and old age. One-child policy, and the problem is that. I could see how that could change, how a government, if it focused on corruption and then decided let's focus on poverty issues and make the move from countryside to cities more effective, I could see how it could all work. But much of what you've been saying says, don't think so. It's not going to work. So I just asked this question. Suppose you gave this talk in Beijing or Shanghai. How do you think people would react to it?
Well, first of all, the fiscal issue, they wouldn't deny it because even when you looked at the recent plenum that the Chinese Communist Party held, fiscal realignment was seen as one of the top priorities. It wasn't really reported that much in the outside press, but so clearly the government understands that this is an issue. I mean, you, in a sense, you kind of answered the question. The kind of way ahead is quite obvious. You need, in broad terms, a massive redistribution of wealth and opportunity from the industrial state sector to the household sector to allow households to be able to look after themselves and have a better standard of living. But it's it's hard to do that when you also have to manage massive debt levels. Because if you do that, then you're going to get a massive increase in non-performing loans. Like if you stop this sort of system going, the non-performing loans will have to be realised. You can't just keep on throwing new credit at managing it. If you realise the non-performing loans, then you need to find resources somewhere to recapitalise the whole banking sector. And where do you get that from? The only way you can get that is from households, from existing savings. I don't really have a solution. I'm not saying it's going to lead to collapse, but if you want to feel sorry for someone or something, it's a Chinese household sector, as you mentioned. I mean, you've got people saving, as you mentioned, to look after their futures, but their savings are returning below market rates, so negative real rates, in order to subsidise the excessive, unneeded industrial activities of mainly SOEs to keep this system going. And because it's gone so far, to change it would lead to all sorts of corporate bankruptcies, would pose a systemic financial risk to the country. So obviously the government's trying to slowly change and slowly alter the situation, but it's hard to see how they can do it without a lot of pain, without a lot of social pain and financial pain. Yeah.
We read a fair amount about regional differences in China and the supposed east-west differences in the level of economic development. Are these local fiscal problems that you're discussing also, do they also show a east-west differential in the severity of the problem?
Yes, they do. I mean, as I mentioned, when they began these fiscal reforms back in the 90s, the idea was that the central government, through its wisdom, would allocate more money to undeveloped regions, which just hasn't happened. All the money pretty much went to the east or coastal regions. So what's happened with the local governments in the poorer regions is because they're not getting a lot of fiscal income either from corporate activity or from a central government, they've been the ones largely driving these so-called Tier 2, Tier 3 city, property developments in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities in order to raise fiscal income. And you're seeing a situation now where the oversupply that I'm talking about, much of it is in the poorer regions where there is no way anyone there could ever afford to buy one of these buildings, but they've been built and they've been sold to speculators in the east coastal regions, just as speculative assets. So, but to answer your question, yes, it's very closely linked. And the western regions don't have a lot of options. I mean, in terms of the restrictions on the migration of labour that China has imposed, it makes all sort of open market sense to get rid of restrictions. Why not allow people to go where work is? The problem is that the rich eastern provincial leaders do not want poor people streaming to their country, and the poorer western regions do not want people leaving their provinces because then they become less important. They have less weight to ask for future funding. So that's why it's the provincial leaders who don't actually want freedom of movement around the country.
Chip Sang again. Related to the last question, isn't there a problem in Chinese bookkeeping was looking at GDP versus national wealth, in the sense that you're talking about poorer regions and especially not poorer cities, but poorer rural regions. And this whole question of land holding and the value of land holding. I mean, there's still an awful lot of peasants who basically don't get anything if they move from their farms to the city. And in principle, you know, if those were changed, your comment about not being able to afford anything, peasants who farmed land, if they had title, might actually be much better off, would actually be much better off
Yeah, I mean,
than they are now. So.
Absolutely. If you look at the first 10 years of reforms, so 79 to 89, most of the economic activity was driven by land reform. So peasants were allowed to use the land any way they wanted. And they were allowed to sell their stuff at market prices. And in fact, if you look at poverty reduction in China between 1979 and now, 75% of poverty reduction occurred in the first 10 years when household incomes are rising faster than GDP. The reverse has happened since the government changed direction. So I agree with you that the only way to raise household incomes, and I'm not making a logical point, I'm making an economic point, is to allow people to use their land to earn income, which hasn't been happening. What's been happening, as you say, is that local governments have been seizing land at low prices to make money for local governments. So yeah, clearly the losers are the households that were on that didn't own but were in possession of that previous plot of land. Yeah.
My question is that what are the specific implications for America due to the Chinese economic slowdown?
So for America,
Yeah.
I don't actually, I mean, economically, I don't see a lot. I mean, China, I know you hear a lot of talk about China driving the global economy and things like that, but my view is that outside commodities, so outside commodity exporters, China hasn't been as large a driver of the global economy as most people believe. And I'll explain what I mean by that. If you look at the trade between America and China, right, most of it is processing trade. So American firms building plants, manufacturing plants in China, those plants assembling stuff in China and around Asia and then shipping it back to Americans or Europeans, right? If China slows down, the export manufacturing sector won't be affected that much because much of it is externally funded anyway. The other reason why I don't think China will have a huge impact on America is it'll be different if China was a major market of end demand for American firms, but it's not. I mean, there are a lot of American firms in China, and it's a significant market, but China still has a very closed market. It's a very protected market outside the export manufacturing sector. So American firms have always seen China as the potential mega growth market, but it hasn't really eventuated as well as most American firms would think or have hoped. So my point is that China isn't driving the American economy and the profitability of American firms as much as most people assume. So, if there's a slowdown, of course there'll be some effect, but I don't actually think there'll be a proportionate effect for the American economy. All right, I think time's due anyway, but no, thanks very much, and thank you all for your time. Thank you.